Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, wow, it's like we're in a library. Shh. All right. I want to welcome everyone to the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to all of our wonderful snowbirds. Can I see a hand of snowbirds here? Woohoo! I'd like to welcome you for your warm spirits and, of course, your impeccable ability to reduce our speed limits here in Rancho Mirage. Seriously, on a serious note, I do want to welcome you back to the Rancho Mirage community and the greater community. It is a pleasure to have you here. My name's Aaron Espinoza, and I am the director of the Rancho Mirage Library, as well as the director of the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. And today we're going to have an incredible afternoon. Thank you. Today we're here for a special conversation featuring our legendary Ed Zwick, whose storytelling has touched countless hearts, shaped cinema in profound ways. Guiding this conversation is none other than the talented Dave Karger. You're all in for a special treat. Now, before we dive in, let me check if we've covered all the bases. Snowbirds, welcoming, introduction, phones. Let's turn those cell phones off. You guys are good. All right. For those of you that want to keep your ringers on, just make sure they're on Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas. My daughters have already decorated the house with a Christmas tree and all. For those of you wanting to have a personalized book or a moment with Mr. Zwick, please line up on the wall over here, and we'll get you over there as soon as possible after the event. A huge thank you goes to Jordan Snitcher. Jordan, we deeply appreciate your incredible support of this writer series. It could not be done without you. I also had an opportunity to speak with Jordan. Thank you. Had an opportunity to speak with Jordan yesterday, and he was telling me how amazing the authors we've put together have been. And I told him, yeah, it's great that you're appreciative of it, but I want to make sure that the audience is appreciative. Are you guys enjoying the authors we're bringing? All right, we'll make sure he knows that. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize Jamie Kabler, our founder. He could not be here in attendance, but I promise you he is watching live stream right now. So hi, Jamie. And before we dive into today's event, I do have a few more thank yous. First, I want to extend our gratitude to our city's guiding team, the City Mirage City Council. Leading the charge is Mayor Steve Downs. Steve's dedication and vision keep our community vibrant and forward-thinking. Alongside him is Mayor Pro Tem Ted Weil. And Ted is a steadfast supporter of progress and community engagement. We also want to honor Councilmember Lynn Mulatto. And Lynn brings passion and commitment to every initiative and project that touches our city. And last, but certainly not least, I'd like to recognize Michael O'Keefe, whose contributions and insights help shape our community's ongoing success. Of course, the heartbeat of many cherished programs and initiatives in our city is the incredible staff of the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. It is their dedication and learning, creativity, and community engagement that makes this institution a beacon of inspiration and innovation. Together, the leadership of the City Council and the tireless efforts of our library and observatory staff ensure that Rancho Mirage remains a place where ideas thrive, stories come to life, and everyone is welcome. Thank you for all that you do for the City Council and for our city staff. Before we look ahead to what the Writer Series is coming up in next season, I'm pretty sure our staff was handing out our new program guide. Please take a look at that. That is jam-packed with programs from December through February. I was just telling the Advisory Commission meeting commissioners earlier today that the cover of it reflects a exhibit that will be here starting in December going through February, and that is an exhibit called When Books Went to War, and it was all about when books went to World War II. The author of that particular titled book, Molly Gumptill Manning, is going to be coming in and curating that exhibit for us. So hopefully in early December, you guys will all be able to come in and see some books that were in World War II. Some of you will be reminiscent. Some of us will be learning a lot of new histories. So please take a look at this program. We haven't announced a whole lot of Writer Series events for spring, but I am happy to announce that on March 4th, we will welcome Bob Mackey, talking about the art of Bob Mackey. On March 11th, we will welcome Adam Nimoy, speaking on his book, The Most Human, Reconciling with My Father, Leonard Nimoy. On March 18th, Ed O'Keefe will present The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, the Women Who Created a President. And last but not least, and I say last but not least, last scheduled at the moment is with Kim Hostretter on April 1st, talking with us about Stuff, a New York life of cultural chaos. But enough about the future. Today is all about storytelling, insight, and inspiration. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ed Zwick and Dave Karger.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Debbie Miller. Thank you, Jamie Kabler. Thank you, Jordan Schnitzer. Thank you, everybody from the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival for having us here. Thank you, Ed, for being here. It's really great to see you.
My pleasure.
I want the room to know that this is a reunion of sorts between me and Ed because 14 years ago, I wrote this cover story in Entertainment Weekly magazine about a great, great, sexy, grown-up romance film called Love and Other Drugs, which Ed directed, starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Anne Hathaway, and we did an interview.
I remember.
And it was so interesting, and I love this cover. It's very sexy, just like the movie is, so it's great to see you after all these years, and I congratulate you on your phenomenally entertaining book, Hits, Flops, and Other Illusions, which you all now have in your hands, so well done. I would love to know how often people would say to you, oh, you've got to write a book. When are you writing your book? I'm sure you must have heard that all the time.
I think more often they said to me, oh, won't you just shut up with these stories? And maybe it was just to that end they got me to write it. I think I'd never had any intention of writing a book. I somehow felt that was presumptuous to think that my life was worthy of a memoir when I'd loved so many memoirs. I was becalmed by COVID. I don't do well in that circumstance. And almost as a kind of an exercise, I mean, I'd kept these notebooks for a long time, and I'm cursed with a pretty good memory. But I did something that I'd never done before, which is I looked at some of my own movies. I just am not that person. But every now and then, I would pass by a living room and I'd hear a familiar thing, and one of my kids would be looking at something, and I'd walk away. Because I think when a director looks at his work, you tend to only look at what doesn't work, what you would have done differently, or else you were so, just blown out on having finished it and the redundancy of that. But when I started to look at them again, I realized that I didn't really care that I couldn't remember what happened in the second act or the 13th episode of something. It was the relationships. All of these people with whom I'd had such intense collaborations, struggles, loves, all of that, and what had happened to them. And were those relationships real, or had they been imagined, or to what end, or why had I chosen to do this rather than that? And I just began sketching anecdotally things. And I never talked to anybody else. I didn't do research. It was all trying to, be in this kind of contemplative state, sitting there while the world was sheltering in place. I was sheltering in a very nice place, in my home, in my bed. And it just evolved. I didn't have an agent. I didn't have I didn't do any of that. I didn't know how we were supposed to go forward.
It was on spec?
It was on spec, absolutely. I'd always wanted, books were the grail, and I some vague sense of slumming to write screenplays. I wanted to be George Orwell or someone. I'd wanted to write essays, and I'd written some journalism. And then there were so many words. It was, when you write a screenplay, it's a form. It's 120 pages. The snow scene is longer than 2 or 3 pages. It has a shape to it in classical unities. And with a book, it's, well,
Mammoth.
How high is up, and how much internal monologue, and how much should be dialogue, and how exposition, and so it was a creative challenge. And once I took it as just a new challenge to do this thing, it got past some of the intimidation of actually writing a book. Although in my computer, how you keep files and you name the files in your computer, mine was B-K, because I didn't dare say the word book, because I felt that would be too daunting. It's almost like in certain religions you don't actually write the name of God.
Right. Jesus, right.
So but then all of a sudden it was a book, and I've got several very fancy friends who are great writers, and I said, could I impose on you to look at this? And they were very encouraging. They were also demanding in a way that I'm sure an editor would have been demanding of me, asking sort of pointed questions and provocative things about what I had done. And mostly what they had driven me to do was to go further inward. And that was the scariest part.
Drop some names for us. Who was helpful?
Adam Gopnik is one of my oldest friends. Kurt Anderson, you know who that is? David Gran. A few those people I think were the three most, and my wife and Marshall, my partner of so many years creatively, and that was the hard part, because I'd always written things that were personal and provocative, and written them and put them in the mouths of much more attractive, better lit, better clothed people than I was. And so I was protected in that regard. And to write in the first person was to sort of say, well, I'm just going to unzip my trousers here and take a look. What do you think? And that was the scary part.
So how did you kind of regiment yourself? I mean, did you say, I'm going to do this for 3 hours a day, and you were very good about it being disciplined, or did it just kind of flow out?
I only have one speed, which is to say it's either balls to the wall or I'm not doing it, and that's how I've approached movies and TV shows with deadlines, journalism too. It's going to be up on Friday, or it's going to be out, and so I had no deadline except my own anxiety and obsessiveness. But no, it came out. It was I didn't know how long it should be, shouldn't be. All in all, it was maybe 6-7 months of writing.
It's the perfect length, can I tell you? And you do chop it up brilliantly. I mean, there's little bite-sized things as well as the longer.
Well,
chapters.
I was guided by certain things that I knew. Dennis Lehane once wrote, and it was Dennis Lehane, or it was Elmore Leonard says, I tend to leave out the part that other people skip. And I wanted to, I wanted to have, it has an agenda. It has a dogmatic agenda about movies to a certain degree, and it has a personal agenda. But I wanted it to be an entertainment. And I just, I don't know. I felt that it should take its own form. I did not want to write that book that says it was a stormy night in Chicago at Michael Reese Hospital where a young man was. I figured exposition that it would come out. If you missed one bus, there'd be another bus by in the next chapter. And
you know what? That's really interesting you say that, because the one thing that I thought was really cool and a great decision on your part is that, talking about leaving out the things that other people skip, is that we do learn about you as a child in this book. Eventually. Here and there, but you don't start with a here I am at age 5 chapter. You get right into it from page 1.
And that's the instinct of a dramatist, of grabbing them and holding on to them and not letting them go and finding something enough, that they feel in good hands and they'll be interested. So that was something that was a guiding light.
Were there books, everyone talks about David Niven's memoir or Adventures in the Screen Trade. There's a couple like just classic movie books. Were there some that were particularly important to you?
Well, you have evoked, the David Niven book is just infinitely entertaining, less insightful psychologically. I think that's the difference, that I presume to go a little deeper into some of those motivations. Christopher Isherwood's book, Prater Violet, was always a real favorite of mine because it's very personal and yet evokes a whole period. What else? Oh gosh. Sidney Lumet's book about making movies, about the craft, is wonderful. I remember that one for sure. And a book, the author of whom I don't remember, there's a biography of Billy Wilder by a New Yorker writer who hated Wilder and yet admired him. And so it has this very interesting tonal sort of ambivalence, which yields something really entertaining. But I don't know, once I was forced by my friends and by my own instincts to go be more personal, be more revealing, that gave me license to be that way about some of the stories I was telling. And I figured, okay, if I'm going to take that risk, then I'm going to go all the way. And that those people who were stupid enough to behave that way in front of a writer just deserved what they got.
That's a really interesting way to put it. Am I also remembering that we learned that you're like a notebook keeper, right? I mean, did that help you?
Yes, but not a journaler. Not a, I don't do it chronologically. I write these things. I have all these beautiful old leather-bound books that I've kept, and they're sort of scrapbooks, and they have things that I've clipped and put in there, and things that I've written in there. And I do deliberately, I don't know why, it's a kind of random, I'll pull down this one, I'll write in this, but then later you see what's juxtaposed with something else. It takes on its own meaning. A picture next to something you've written, something that you've pulled, a program from this, a ticket stub. And so I have really a shelf of them, but it wasn't like I was, Proust. I wasn't, chronicling my life.
Oh, so those notebooks were less helpful than I would have thought they would have been.
They were helpful. They were really helpful because a lot of what I also wrote in there was some of the, like the teachers, the stuff of Nina Foch, the Maxims, and the stuff from other directors, Sidney Pollack, things that I had actually written down. So I did spend time culling and then put them into files and then did use a bunch of it, yeah.
So you mentioned Nina Foch. For someone like me who works for Turner Classic Movies, I'm like, tell me more about Nina Foch.
Oh, wow.
So when you were at the AFI, she was an instructor and just, of course, the actress from American in Paris.
She blew our minds. She was a kind of transitional, or a kind of unifier of a certain tradition to a certain modernity, because she had been, a disciple of Lee Strasberg and Uta Hagen, and who am I forgetting? Anyway, all of that had been in her at the studio, and then she had been a player, a contract player at MGM with Harry Cohn. And then she had, worked with George Stevens, and then had become a teacher, and was a wonderful teacher. Was a provocative, confrontive, very, really engaging personality, and terrifying. But yeah, she was great. And it became a link for a lot of us to some of the past that we didn't know, and encouraged us to really go and look at what they were doing then, and how did this style of acting evolve, and how did, all of that. And so she was very important to a lot of us. And there's a whole list of people who came out of AFI at that moment. And some are cinematographers like Caleb Deschanel, directors like Marty Brest and Terry Malick, and some are, great, writers and directors.
In the book, you take us behind the scenes of so many terrific TV series and films that you've worked on, and a lot of it has to do with your business partner, Marshall Herskovitz, who you are about to celebrate 50 years of professional partnership with Marshall, which is a record.
It is.
No one has lasted that long. I want to ask you about 30-something, because that really was one of the first kind of big successes that you guys had together. And it's really interesting to read you writing about it, because in the book you talk about how groundbreaking it was perceived to have been, but you're saying that you guys were kind of cribbing from the likes of Preston Sturges and Howard Hawks in certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we were interested in relationships, and the 1970s really already was breaking that ground. If you think about some of Paul Mazursky's movies and Hal Ashby's movies, if you think about The Big Chill and what that was already, that, and John Sayles, the Secaucus 7, those were movies that were there, but television was like 10 years behind. Everybody in television was a cop or a fireman or a lawyer or a doctor, and nobody really had families, and there were no fights, and nobody was ambivalent, and people were just, father knows best and make room for somebody or whatever it was. It was just, it was just pleasant, and it was, Marshall used to say it was like watching science fiction. And so we just presumed to try to do what those people had done before us, and the French movies, you look at the Truffaut movies and all those things, they were way ahead. And so but for television, it was revolutionary. And the funny thing now is that's become the norm. Everything, and about 5 years after us, I guess there was Friends, but everything on television now seems to be this arbitrary way to get a group of people together and set them spinning. But at the time, that was radical.
What do you remember of the episode that came out where the two men seen together in bed? Were you taken aback at the response to it?
We sort of knew that we were going into the maws of the lion. I mean, it was it's interesting because everybody who wrote on the show had their own sense of what they wanted the show to be, and we tried to keep enlarging the tent. And Richard Kramer had been really one of my closest friends since I came to California, and he felt that we were not honestly representing the experience of being that age, and he was right. And we said, well, how do we deal with that? And it wasn't just about presenting a gay relationship, or not even about putting a pair of gay men in bed, but normalizing them in bed. And by the way, I think already that Billy Crystal show, Soap, I think had presented a relationship that was comedically treated. So I don't think what we did was particularly radical, but doing it on network television was. And we really had to fight our way through it because initially they didn't want to air it, and then we literally shamed them into airing it by talking to some journalists and telling them what we were doing, and sort of, better asking for
forgiveness than permission?
Yeah, whatever that phrase is, yeah. And but then once they aired it, all the advertisers pulled out. An interesting phrase. But then they refused to air it a second time. It was never rerun.
No.
And the funny thing is that the show, I can pretty safely say, is finally going to be on television. It's going to stream maybe after January. So people have not been able to see it for 20 years unless they have a DVD player, which no one else.
How exciting!
Yeah.
I love that. It is fascinating to see the trajectory of your film and television work, and to learn that the same guy who was partially behind 30-something directed The Last Samurai, with Tom Cruise and Ken Watanabe. I mean, there were many steps between one and the next, but when you think back to that transition, does it strike you as kind of miraculous that you were even able to do it?
Well, it's funny thing is that, I was a theater kid, and even at a very young age, I was exposed to some really interesting content, and a variety of content, whether it was the musical theater or whether it was Dürrenmatt. It was an enlightened and kind of really very interesting, provocative thing to show to a 16 and a 17-year-old, that part of the world. And then in college, that was amplified. And so I thought when I graduated college that I would be a director in a regional theater someplace doing Strindberg one night and Tom Stoppard the next, and Sam Shepard the night after. That promiscuity of interests kept up, so that this may sound ridiculous, but to go from doing 30-something to then doing Glory did not seem to be so different to me, only because it was a story and it was about these relationships, and yes, there were a few more people involved, and I did what I often did is I was a little bit studious. I looked at a lot of Kurosawa movies. I looked at a lot of those masters who had worked with larger canvases, but it still is about a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a scene is constructed, and maybe the beginning, middle, and end is a battle, but it still has a shape to it, and it adheres to certain classical unities, and I realized after the fact that it was presumptuous. Maybe I was just too stupid and young to know that.
Well, the movies came out and they
worked.
won Oscars, so
yeah.
couldn't have been that bad. You mentioned Glory, and this book has been out a few months now, and I think one of the chapters that has gotten the most attention is the Glory chapter, because you write about your experience working with Matthew Broderick, and more to the point, his mom, who the two of them did not exactly make your life easy on the set of this movie. When you all go home, you can read all about it. But I'd be curious to know if that was a story when it was going on, if you could even believe what was happening in your life, and you can tease a little bit of it.
Well, I mean, I've had the experience a couple times of working with young actors who are given too much responsibility too young, and it's not a constructive thing. And there are a lot of reasons for it. In his case, some particular reasons for it. And I knew what I had in my hands with that story. I was so attached to it. I was so dedicated that I would have done anything, short of murder, to have protected it. And if that meant going against a harridan of a mother and a very scared 24-year-old who was self-destructive, I was just going to do it and damn everybody else. And it's a little bit bloody-minded, I know, but you get into a thing which is a little bit monomaniacal. You have this task, and you are that Ahab, at the helm saying, "Oh, the whale is there," and you just do it. And after the fact, as time, rounded the edges, and I could see it as a story there, I realized just what I might have been going through. The truth is, though, that's the best chapter in the book. Frankly, that part of it is fun. The stuff about Denzel and Morgan and Andre and the history, I realized when I was in the middle of it, I could have written that as a book. There was so much more even that I could have written about the actual process of making a movie, because it had everything in it.
Well, it seems like the making of Glory astounded you. It seems like you were mystified and in awe of the cast that you had put together.
Absolutely.
Particularly these men that you're talking about, Andre Brower, Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington.
Yes, and humbled, aware that I was in the presence of something much larger than myself. That I was, the most important lesson is sometimes the best thing to do is nothing. That to allow the magic to take place. And when you're in the presence of talent of that magnitude, that there's so much to be gotten if you're not over-determinative of it. And that was a very important lesson to me that has stood me instead at other times. Not that I haven't mistaken and gone the other way to my own peril at other times, but it was a remarkable experience of feeling that you were in the presence of something great, and if you could only get out of its way and give it its nurturing, then it would happen. And I knew that from the minute I read the monograph by Lincoln Kirsten about it. And so it all became this thing in the service of a story that needed to be told. It was historical redress. It was important, I thought, culturally and politically. And so it grew.
Did it blow your mind that so early in your film career you had a movie that won several Oscars, including one for Denzel Washington?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I say that, that's funny. Why did I say it like that? The reason I say that is because I, it's like, whom the gods choose to, that whom the gods choose to destroy, they first make young and successful. That in the same year, 30-something had won Best Show, and Glory had been this thing, and I was just bulletproof. I was invulnerable, and I was heading for such a fall. and that's part of the reason I wrote the book, is because the idea of that kind of roller coaster and that manic depressive cycle of hits and flops. But the phrase, which I hope I quote in there, I think I talk about, because it's a Preston Sturges phrase, which says, a hit is the thing you do between flops.
Right, you did sit there.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
great.
And that again was instructive, because it happened to me more than once, because failure is baked into the DNA of any artistic process. In fact, you have to put yourself out there. You have to just be convinced. You make those Custer decisions. There are no Indians over that hill. Well, he was wrong.
Well, and also one thing that really opened my eyes as someone who has, this perception of someone like you, like just getting to do whatever you want, whenever you want, as far as your professional career. And then you read here that, like, you talk about going into meetings, particularly these days, with, younger kind of executives or development people, and you write something like, oh, if ever I go into a meeting and the person says, oh, I really just want to tell you how much I loved this movie that you made, then you say, I know I'm not getting the job.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
I'd be curious to know when you discovered that. When did you realize that was the trend? Someone compliments your prior work, that means you're not getting the new work.
It's been in the last 10 years, I think. There's been such a sea change in what movies are. What are movies? Is a streaming movie a movie? I suppose it is. But all of that has changed so radically as the culture has changed around it, and as the sort of hegemony of movies, the movies as an alpha thing in our sphere of entertainment has diminished. So yeah, it and some notion of what is ageism, and how is that possible for someone who was still 20 in his own mind to be the victim of ageism. But I don't know. On the other hand, a very wise friend of mine said to me, here's the deal. He said, when you were 25, you had to work 3 times as hard to try to get ahead and get a job and to matriculate. He said, that's the same thing when you're 60. You just have to work 3 times as hard in order to just continue, if you want to continue. And that actually was comforting, because I can do that, and I did that before, and you have the same resources and the same energy and the same self-image, however delusionary, of who you are.
So when's the bracket of time where you don't have to work so hard? If it's 25 here and 6, so like from 32 to 34?
No, but they're always, if it's in retrospect, you look back and realize, oh, something was a halcyon moment and you missed it, or you were unaware of it as it was happening because you were so involved. Time goes so fast when you're so engaged, and you don't have any time to be contemplative about it.
Speaking of the Oscars, as many people may know, you are an Oscar winner as one of the producers of Shakespeare in Love, which won Best Picture. But as you write about in the book, that was just almost like a debacle after another. The whole making of that movie and the development of the movie, it had false starts. It was going to happen, then it wasn't, and then it finally did. And then Harvey Weinstein came along and kind of took it away and put his hands all over it, and even kind of like
that's a horrible. That's a very particularly apt image, David. Thank you for that. But the crowd really.
I know that was bad. That was bad. Yeah, I apologize for that one. But when you think back to that whole experience, is when I wrote my book, which I now see is even hanging on the wall.
My book. Did you notice that there's a little plug that he plugged himself?
I did not put it there. It was there. But I actually interviewed Mira Sorvino for my book, and she won her Oscar for a movie, Mighty Aphrodite, that was distributed by Harvey Weinstein. And she spoke very openly about how his involvement kind of tainted the experience and even tainted the award a little bit for her. What's your feeling on it all these decades?
Well, I talk about it in the book. I have several thoughts. And a couple of them I think I write down that you know, the Medici and the Borgias were monsters, murderous, treacherous, lecherous creatures who brought forth the Renaissance. You know, and you can be two things at once. But as a friend of mine once said, that in France there are these pigs who snuffle in the shit and the mud to find truffles, right? But at the end of the day, they're still pigs.
But we get to enjoy the truffles.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the heyday of Miramax was when I was a young writer at Entertainment Weekly. I mean, the things that they put out
I see,
phenomenal.
That's it. And I miss, the owner-manager times when it was people's own money and invested in the doing of the things, so they were personally invested in, and it wasn't about the algorithm. It wasn't to serve the P&L projections of the multinational corporations that own them, or the branding companies, or the product, the retail companies like Apple, or the tech companies like Netflix. They were, mom and pop businesses that were invested in the thing they were doing. But it was one person making a decision, and that's the way that art finally has been any chance of succeeding. It's not the team. Everything now is the team. This is the legacy of Silicon Valley. And you finish talking to people about something, they say, well, let the team just talk about that. And you go, oh, well, fuck, because, you can't please any group of 4 representative people in a room, and because inevitably the person who has the most objections will have the most power, and things will get diminished and diluted and become more acceptable and palatable, which is not the role of art. It is to be disquieting and disruptive, and to be upsetting to some, and deliriously attractive to others, and that's what makes it good. And so that's not the way it was. I was lucky enough in certain instances to have things happen because one person at the right moment saw it, while 8 others didn't, typically. But that one person said, I know what that is. That raises the hair on my arms. That gets me hard. I like that, and that made it happen. And I could find those people every now and then.
As someone who loves to watch Oscar speeches, you write about being a little disappointed that you did not get a chance to participate in the acceptance speech. Donna Gelati, one of the producers, spoke, another of the producers, and then it was kind of supposed to be your turn, but then Donna kind of made it clear that she was passing the mic over to Harvey, and you just kind of had to stand there.
I'm glad you're vilifying her, by the way, because she deserves it. Go ahead.
But yeah. So I'd love to know what you were going to say.
Oh, God, I've never thought about that.
Well, you have a chance now. What would you like to say?
I would have thanked my teachers. I've had so many. One of them's in the room tonight, I think, actually, somewhere. I know he's out there somewhere, Dennis. You said you were going to be around here. I haven't seen him in years. He was a drama teacher of mine in high school.
Oh, great.
There were others in college.
Oh, lift this up towards your mouth like a little bit, tiny bit.
Am I there?
Yeah.
Okay. There were others in college. You evoked Nina Foch. I had a couple of mentors. A great director named Sidney Pollack was there for me. And Marshall and my wife. There have been so many who have literally just graced my life.
I love that. One aspect of the movie-making process that you write about in such a way that was very eye-opening to me was the whole concept of a first meeting between a director and a potential star.
Yeah.
A courtship, if you will. And a lot of times in interviews, you hear the star say, or the director say, oh, we just hit it off so great, everything, we were just on the same page from the very beginning. And what you learn from this book is that you describe it as being very false, feeling very false, and feeling like it's awkward because the star doesn't want to show their hand too much. How can this be fixed so that it doesn't feel so awkward?
Well, I mean, I've developed a little technique, but it's also, it's taking advantage of more falseness, I suppose. I mean, I tend to look at some, interviews that they've done, on whatever, YouTube or various things, because finally, after a certain amount of looking at somebody's presentational self, you can glean little clues as to who they really are, because they want to tell you. People want you to know who they are. And, when you meet them, you are each sending out your ambassadors. This is the best version of myself, and there's, that part over there, we're not really talking about that, but that's really what it is an audition or a judgment on one's part. On the other hand, you want to have a real relationship, then they want to have a real relationship, maybe. It's more important, I think, for you to want to have a real relationship than for them to, because it's your job to find out what are the buttons to push or the ways to elicit that thing that you need, because you only need it once in focus, and however it takes to get there, you're going to do it. But they also want you to understand what they need. And the problem is that everybody is different. Everybody wants to be made love to differently. And if you make the mistake of trying to make love to someone the way that it worked for somebody else, it tends not to work. And you have to listen, and you have to be sensitized to what, then they'll tell you, but not overtly. So you have to sort of pay attention. Yeah. But the problem is nobody auditions when you get to be at a certain eminence. So one thing to trust, I think, is also their sense of themselves, what works best for themselves. In other words, I think that great actors, why does Tom Cruise have the career that he does? Because he knows what he can do and probably has stayed away from what he can't do. Same, there's always some persona that they think that is going to be projected that they're going to hold on to at the same time that they're playing this part or that part. And a lot of times what I'll do, if I have a script, I'll read it, and then I'll watch them do a couple other movies and try to go into some weird fugue state where I imagine them in that role, because they're never going to audition. So do what you can, and then it's a crapshoot, because sometimes it doesn't work.
In the book, you go into so many fascinating stories about your experience working with some of the biggest stars ever, people who you ended up working with or people that you didn't end up working with. So whether it's Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise and Denzel Washington to Julia Roberts, who you ended up not working with. Who are 3 people, top of your list, top of your head, that you will always want to work with, actors?
Liev Schreiber. There's nothing he can't do, and he hasn't done some of it yet.
You made Defiance with him.
And
Pawn Sacrifice.
Yeah, Pawn Sacrifice, which he did entirely in Russian. What people don't know quite about him is just how warm and funny he is.
You don't get that from Ray Donovan.
No. But maybe if you saw him, say, in talk radio,
right,
and on Broadway, most of that you've seen on Broadway, but not on film. People don't think to cast him that way. Tony Shalhoub, who can
The Siege. You did The Siege with him.
I did The Siege with him, but he could do anything too. He's one of these labile, wonderful, actors. And can I say it's a tie between DiCaprio and Denzel? Because they neither of them can do anything that isn't printable on the first take. It's always interesting, and it's kind of like, it's the difference between driving a Ferrari or a truck with no power steering. A truck with power steering, you have to crank the, but if you have a Ferrari, you just go like this and the wheel goes like that. And that's what they are. And so I could come up with 4 other ones, probably. Annette Bening,
Basically the entire cast of The Siege.
Well, there you go.
Annette, Tony, and Denzel.
And now someone is going to tell somebody on 30-something that I didn't mention one of them. Or Claire Danes, excuse me, she was 13 and a half when I first cast her.
My So-Called Life.
But, so, right. Too many.
I do want to ask you a little bit more about Love and Other Drugs, because it is the movie where I got to know you, and I love it so much. But what I did not know, in the midst of learning about the film, seeing the film, interviewing you for the film, was that you were going through essentially a major health crisis during the making, and I would assume still the promotion of the movie with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I had gone through R-CHOP, serious chemotherapy that had ended about 2 weeks before we started shooting. And, the actors were extraordinarily generous and mindful, and as I would start to fall asleep in my chair. But, like a lot of things, who knew that I was about to make a movie about someone with a health crisis after I had just gone through a health crisis, and it totally informed the experience for me. It also was by far the happiest experience I'd ever had, because who knew, I didn't know that I would ever live, let alone work again. So the sense of gratitude at that point was immeasurable, and the fact that I was essentially playing with house money at that point. It was, it was one of those also very intimate movies. I mean, they're naked half the time, and it's about a very intense personal relationship. And I had done so many big canvas movies before that. I think I'd done 3 in a row of 3 big movies, and to just be there with those 2 people, and we became. I mean, we went through some interesting things, showing each other our famous, sex scenes from movies as to what got us off and what did we want to show, what did we not want to show, but also other much more intimate things than sex, frankly, talking about your, life and death. And but it was like being able to go back in the theater and sit around with a cup of coffee, and it's just 2 people and talking about scene work and, that stuff, which was, the root of all of it, which is a little bit hard to do sometimes with explosions going off and,
For sure.
Gunfire.
Well, I mean, for me, I saw one of your other earlier films, About Last Night, with Demi Moore and Rob Lowe.
Another fuck movie.
Yeah, right. But a movie that has a through line, I think, to Love and Other Drugs. I think that's one of the reasons why I responded so
That's right.
strongly to that, because that was such an important film for me. So was a decision made during the promotion and release of Love and Other Drugs that you and your cast would not discuss what you were going through, or did it just not come up?
It's funny, I guess it just didn't come up. I mean, I wasn't hiding it, but then neither have I had a very public life in media that anybody would have been particularly interested, I guess. It just didn't come up, and I guess the only reason I wrote about it is because it absolutely fit into talking about my personal experience in the chronology of making movies, that I think it would have been disingenuous to not talk about it. So I did.
As you were getting ready to release this book, did you or your publishers have in mind, like, oh, these are going to be the 5 things that take off and get picked up and get talked about? Were you surprised by what made news and what didn't?
It's interesting. I mean, it's funny. When I first showed the book to a couple of agents who turned it down, basically they wrote these lovely notes, as literary agents tend to write, right? They're the nicest rejections. and mostly, I think when I read the code was, it's really, really like it, but you're not famous enough.
Oh.
In other words, we can't, you didn't die of a drug overdose, you weren't the star of a sitcom, whatever, we can't put you on the cover of the book. And I thought, well, no, what people are going to want to hear about is the dish, because there's enough of that, and in fact becomes a kind of chronicle of a certain kind of celebrity over time. And ironically, it was a friend of mine worked for Graydon Carter, had worked for him at Vanity Fair, and a woman named Alexandra Stanley, who you probably know, I'm sure you do.
I know her name, I don't
know.
Yeah.
And she was a friend of mine from college, and I sent her the manuscript to talk about, and she went, she was going to work for Graydon on this thing called Airmail, which is a subscription thing for...
newsletter, yeah.
Yeah, a newsletter. And she said, could we publish a chapter? This is before the book it wasn't a book, right? I said, yeah. And so she did, and that became a kind of cock tease to other publishers who looked at that and said, "Oh, could we see the rest of the manuscript?" And they did, and then all of a sudden I had offers and I had a book.
Which chapter ran in?
It was the Shakespeare in Love chapter. That's what they ran.
Yeah.
Because at that moment, particularly with Harvey and all that, it was, in the news.
For sure. So when it came out, who did you hear from?
Good, bad, or indifferent, you mean? Well, I never heard from Julia, but I hadn't heard from her in 20 years before. I also heard from people who wished that they'd been in the book, and how dare I not include them? It precipitated an interesting conversation with Anne Hathaway because we'd been very close and had drifted apart, and that was interesting because I talk about something honestly in the book that led to a very interesting moment in there. Liberty, my wife of this many years, was I think pleased by it because she's a kind of co-star in the book, except was very concerned why I spend so much time talking about another girl in the first chapter. And Marshall, who's a complete press whore, I just, wanted more and more about himself in the book. I said, come on, I do give him far more credit than he deserves.
Your company with Marshall Herskovitz is called Bedford Falls, of course, named after the town It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
I'm shocked that name was available. You guys
that's funny you'd say that because, that movie had been very central to our experience as partners, and we saw it when we were film school and really have related to it in 100 different ways. You have to apply for a company name, I think it's whether it's state or federal or whatever, a registry to get a name, right? And we did it. And 6 months later, we got someone wanted to object and ask if we would step aside from the title because they wanted it for their own company, and it was Rob Reiner. And we said no. But that's a point where they chose Castle Rock because Castle Rock was the name of the place in Stand By Me.
Stand By Me.
Which in all the Stephen King, sort of universe was important. And so that was literally right at the same time we were each forming our companies.
Rob Reiner did just fine.
He's okay.
In the book, you are equally as frank about yourself as you are about some of these big names that you work with. How did you find that part of the process, kind of coming face to face with what you perceive as your own flaws and shortcomings?
Look, somebody once said that memoir is the highest form of fiction. And to create a persona for yourself, you are choosing what to present, what to hide. I know when we wrote 30-something, we used to talk about the octane of truth. We felt that we were upping the octane of truth, like gasoline. The octane, we would push it into the 80s, but never into the 90s, because at a certain point it becomes just difficult and then unattractive and then impossible, because you don't want something unalloyed, you want some artfulness to it. So similarly, I have been candid about certain people who deserve it, but I've actually been generous to others who may have deserved it, but for some more humanist or sensitivity to them, and that's a judgment call. It is. I guess I drew a bright line between those things that they did that affected the work or were part of the work, and those secrets that I will take to my grave about personal lives, because that's not the book that I was writing. So maybe that's how I judged it.
That's a great rule. Let me end with this. Having gone through this entire process and writing about yourself and your career, what understanding or conclusion have you come to as to why you've had the successful career you have? Is it luck? Is it passion?
I would say the closer I can be to that kid who sat in a theater and did it for free and stayed up late and, you know, had all the fights and the, you know, the passion and the drama of it. The more I can recapitulate that feeling and the fact that that feeling has remained central to me is at its heart. And finally, what that's about is love. And because it's never been, I mean, there may have been moments when I thought it was about money or about sex or about fame, but it actually hasn't been that. You're the first person to have asked me this question, so I think it's a fair one. If you love what you do and can hold on to that love, that's been the secret.
Keep doing it. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Ed Zwick, everybody. You are all in for a treat when you read this book. It's really great. Great to spend time with you.
Great, Dave. Thank you.
And I'll see you all in March with Bob Mackie. I'll be here interviewing Bob Mackie in March,
Cool.
so I'll see you then. Thanks so much.
You're great, man. You should do this for a living.